We have analyzed the flow between an upstream gate and a downstream reservoir, considering a constant bed slope. In the reality, the bed slope can change as illustrated here for this side channel spillway. There is a transition from a mild slope to a steep slope, then an increase of this steep slope, and finally a reduction to a mild slope again at the entrance of the stilling basin. In this lesson, we will analyze the different possible transitions between bed slopes. Remember that the critical depth is almost independent of the bed slope, while the normal depth decreases for an increasing bed slope. So, depending on the values of the upstream and downstream bed slopes compared to the critical slope SC, we will investigate the possible combinations of flow profiles. Let's start with an increasing bed slope. If we consider two mild slopes, S01 and S02, both below SC, but S02 larger than S01, the critical and normal depths are as illustrated here. We will assume that far away from this local change of bed slope, the flow is not influenced by any boundary conditions, in such a way that the normal depth HU prevails at the upstream and downstream ends of this channel. If the normal depth prevails at the downstream end of the channel, then the flow has to be a uniform flow mu in the downstream reach, because if we look here at the different possible M profiles, there is no mild slope profile that progressively tends to the normal depth in the downstream direction. So we only have the mu profile. It means that if we want to have the normal depth at the end of the channel, we should have it already at the beginning of this reach. In the upstream reach, starting from the normal depth, we then have a M2 profile with a decreasing water depth to connect with the downstream mu profile. As the M2 profile is a subcritical flow profile controlled by the downstream conditions, it can indeed connect with the downstream normal depth HU2. We can have a similar situation for steep slopes, with S02 being larger than S01 and both slopes being larger than the critical slope SC. With a normal depth assumed far away upstream and downstream from the change in bed slope, we can only have a SU profile in the upstream reach, because there is no supercritical flow profile that tends to the uniform flow in the upstream direction. In the downstream reach, we have a S2 profile that starts from HU1 and tends to HU2. This S2 profile is a supercritical profile, controlled by the upstream conditions. In this case, it is the upstream normal depth HU1. Now, in the case of a transition from a mild slope to a steep slope, so with S01 smaller than SC and S02 larger than SC, the flow profile will have to cross the critical depth if we consider that a uniform flow prevails upstream and downstream, far away from the change in bed slope. We will thus have a M-type profile in the upstream reach and a S-type profile in the downstream reach. The only possible combination between a M-type profile starting from the normal depth and flowing until the critical depth and a S-type profile starting from the critical depth and flowing towards the normal depth is the following one: a M2 profile in the upstream reach and a S2 profile in the downstream reach. This M2-S2 combination allows to cross the critical depth here without hydraulic jump, and it is the only possible solution in the present case. Indeed, we have seen that a hydraulic jump with a decreasing depth is impossible because of the head losses. Such a smooth transition through the critical depth is defined as a control section. At such a control section, the upstream and downstream flow profiles are disconnected from each other through the crossing of the critical depth. No information from the downstream reach can travel back in the upstream reach. After the increasing bed slopes, we can now analyze the cases of a decreasing bed slope in the same way. Let us first consider a mild slope that becomes even milder. This means that HU2 will be larger than HU1. Both bed slopes S01 and S02 are smaller than the critical slope SC, in such a way that we will have only M-type profiles. We still assume that the uniform flow prevails far away upstream and downstream from the change in bed slope. So, in the downstream reach, we can only have a MU profile, as we have shown before already, because this is the only one that tends to the normal depth. No other mild slope profile reaches the normal depth in the downstream direction. In the upstream reach, a M1 profile will develop to increase the water depth from HU1 to HU2. The downstream controlled M1 profile simply connects to the water depth HU2 in the downstream reach. In the case of a steep slope that becomes less steep but still remains a steep slope, we will have two S-type profiles, with normal depth HU2 larger than the normal depth HU1. The flow in the upstream reach can only be a uniform flow. Again, we see that there is no supercritical flow profile that tends to the normal depth in the upstream direction. Then, in the downstream reach, starting from HU1, we will have a S3 profile that will tend to the normal depth HU2, because we have said that the uniform flow prevails far away from the change in bed slope. A more complex situation arises when we have a transition from a steep slope S01 to a mild slope S02. This can happen, for example, when a steep mountain stream flows into a larger river in the main valley. If we consider that the uniform flow prevails upstream and downstream, the flow has to cross the critical depth. But here, as the upstream flow is supercritical and the downstream flow subcritical, we will have a hydraulic jump. The question then is to know where this hydraulic jump will occur. In the upstream reach or in the downstream reach. With the normal depth HU1 as upstream boundary condition and HU2 as downstream boundary condition, we will have a SU profile in the upstream reach and a MU profile in the downstream reach. The positions of the sequent curves SU' and MU' indicate that the hydraulic jump will be located in the downstream reach. Indeed, if we assume a hydraulic jump in the upstream reach, we should calculate this S1 profile. However, we see that this S1 profile does not cross the SU' curve, as it starts from a depth HU2 that is below SU' at the location of the change in bed slope. So this solution is impossible, and the hydraulic jump will occur in the downstream reach. Assuming now a hydraulic jump in the downstream reach, we calculate this M3 profile, starting from HU1. This M3 profile crosses the MU' curve here, and this intersection indicates the position of the hydraulic jump. So the final flow profile in the channel is as illustrated. A SU profile followed by a M3 profile in the mild slope ridge, and then a hydraulic jump to connect with the uniform flow MU. How could we then observe a hydraulic jump in the upstream ridge? If the bed slope S02 becomes even milder, the normal depth HU2 increases. And in that case, the downstream MU profile is above the SU prime curve. If we calculate the M3 profile from HU1 as we have done in the previous case, we observe that it does not cross the MU prime curve because it starts from a depth that is above MU prime. This means that a hydraulic jump in the downstream ridge is impossible in this case. But if we calculate the S1 profile from HU2, we see that it crosses the SU prime curve, indicating a possible hydraulic jump here. So, the final flow profile is this one: a supercritical uniform flow SU, then a hydraulic jump to connect with the subcritical S1 profile until the normal depth HU2. All the possible cases of changes in bed slope are summarized here. Of course, the principles described in this lesson to find the connection between water profile on different slopes, different bed slopes, remain valid for other boundary conditions, for example, an upstream gate or a downstream reservoir, as we have seen in previous lessons. So, we have analyzed in this lesson a first type of singularity, that is a change in bed slope. Now it remains to analyze the changes in channel width. This will be for the next lesson. Goodbye.